we have obtained a very interesting, important financial support for our national ministers. So we are going to play many other opportunity for young scholars, and not only for young scholars, to discuss around this topic. So Giovanni, do you want to introduce Mikko, please?
Sure.
Thank you again. So we are going.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I was starting the YouTube. I had some technical problem,
Okay,
but now everything is
okay. I
okay.
think that you can introduce Mikko,
Sure.
and after we can start with the paper.
Sure, sure. Thank you all for coming today and for taking part in this last seminar of the series. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mikko Immanen. Mikko earned his PhD in history at the University of Helsinki in 2017. Since then, he has been a Fulbright Fellow in the CUNY Graduate Center in New York and published 2 books on modern German thought at Cornell University Press. This book deal with the Frankfurt School, so the topic he's talking about today, and the first book is Toward a Concrete Philosophy, Heidegger and the Emergence of the Frankfurt School, and the second one is Adorno's Gamble, Harnessing German Ideology. At the moment, he's working on his new project on German Jewish reactions to Germany's effort and political renewal after World War II. Our 2 discussants, I introduce them briefly now, are Annarita Gori. Annarita is researcher at the Instituto de Ciências, Sociais, the University of Lisbon. Sorry, my Portuguese is not very good. She earned her PhD at the University of Siena, and her research focuses on the concept and rituals of nation building and the public use of memory in the construction of collective identity. She has published a book on this topic about Florence. She's the coordinator of the project Export in Portugal, Estado Novo, Cultural Diplomacy and Rebranding Strategies in the United States, 1933-1974, financed by the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology. Maurizio is a researcher at the Italian-German Historical Institute in Trento. He earned his PhD at the University of Trento. He has been visiting in many universities, especially in Germany, Frankfurt, in Berlin, and he has been dealing with and published about German intellectuals forced to migrate during the Nazi era, and the history of juridical culture in Germany between the Weimar Republic and the post-war, the history of corporatism, and on visual culture. He has coordinated many research projects. Among them, the most recent is The Birth of Modern Trentino, financed by the Bank Foundation in Trento. So I leave the floor to Mikko for his 45 minutes presentation, and then Annarita and Maurizio will have 10 to 20 minutes for their comments and questions, and then we will open the floor for other questions. So please, Mikko, share your screen and start whenever you want.
Thank you. You can see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, good. And I am good to go, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. At the very beginning, I would like to say my heartfelt thanks to the organizers of this event, and I'm very pleased that I was invited to be part of this intriguing cycle of seminars on migrations, exile, and anti-fascism. And so my purpose in this presentation is to explore what I think is a relatively little-known episode in the German-Jewish struggle against Nazism, namely the intelligence work that the Frankfurt School critical theorists Franz Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, and Herbert Marcuse did for the United States foreign intelligence during the final years of the Second World War. It is intriguing that these unorthodox Marxist scholars, all of whom came from a German-Jewish background, had dedicated their previous lives on moralist theoretical efforts in philosophy, political science, and law. However, in 1943, 1945, they were offered a unique chance to put their expert knowledge of Germany at the service of the Allied war machine. It was during these years that the United States' first ever centralized foreign intelligence agency, called the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, recruited several German and European emigrant scholars to aid the United States and the Allies to defeat Nazi Germany, as well as to plan a post-Hitler Germany, and finally to draft the charges against the Nazis after the war in Nuremberg trials. The OSS was shut down after the war, and it can be viewed as the forerunner to the CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, that was founded in 1947. And now my goal here is to offer an overview of the intelligence work that Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer did for the Office of Strategic Services in Washington, D.C. I will talk, for instance, about their motives to join in its ranks, about their views of the nature of Nazi Germany and how it could be defeated, about their opinions of how Germany should be treated after the war, and the impact their contributions had, and often failed to have, on the US and the Allied policies during and immediately after the war. I should mention here that the reports that the Frankfurt School thinkers wrote for the OSS during the war are located in the United States National Archives in Maryland. These reports were declassified in the mid-1970s, and many of them, though not all, are contained in the brilliant book from 2013 that you can see on the slide here, called Secret Reports on Nazi Germany, edited by Raffaele Laudani. But before going into my main topic in this lecture, I would like to emphasize that these three thinkers' largely overlooked work for the US war effort provides a rather different image of the Frankfurt School than the one usually associates with it. A quite common perception of the Frankfurt School is that it was by and large an unpolitical phenomenon, despite its evident neo-Marxist thrust and its many famous and discerning studies of 20th century capitalism and its discontents. It can be said that hard as the Frankfurt School, which was of course led by Max Horkheimer and Theodor W. Adorno, tried to change the world, in the words of Karl Marx, a notable feature of its work was that it was more about interpreting the world than changing it. And this was of course something that the Frankfurt School was often criticized for by their more orthodox Marxist contemporaries. The accepted wisdom is then that the Marxist goal of uniting theory and practice was something that the Frankfurt School failed to accomplish. While this is correct to a certain extent, this image, I think, is a half-truth at best. What it overlooks is the politically motivated intelligence work that the Frankfurt School's less famous figures, Franz Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, did to defeat Nazism as employees of the US foreign intelligence. It is indeed quite intriguing that they engage in this explicitly political work exactly at the same time that Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno were writing the Frankfurt School's perhaps most famous work, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, in peaceful California. The contrast is indeed quite large, as Horkheimer and Adorno intended their rather hermetic and difficult work as a message in a bottle that had very little to contribute to the urgent political fight against Hitler. I have divided my talk in three parts that will unfold chronologically. I will begin with the year 1943. This year saw Neumann, Kirchheimer, and Marcuse move to Washington, D.C. to work for the OSS and to help it gain a better understanding of what was the nature of the enemy that the United States was fighting against. In the second part, my focus will be on the year 1944, when it already looked certain that Germany would lose the war. Here I will examine the critical theorists' reports that try to inform the US government about possible ways to bring the war to its end and how the post-war denazification process ought to be carried out. And in the final section, I will discuss the ways that the Frankfurt School contributed to the empirical and conceptual preparation of the Nuremberg trials after the war in 1945-1946. As I mentioned, the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, was the United States' first centralized foreign intelligence agency. And actually, the United States was the last of the great powers to establish such an institution, which happened with the foundation of the OSS in 1942 after the terrible shock of Pearl Harbor. One of the key branches of the OSS was the so-called Research and Analysis Branch, which was, in fact, the country's largest research institution at the time, with over 1,200 employees. At first, it was only the American-born scholars who were allowed to do intelligence work. Many of them were the most gifted students of the country's most esteemed professors in social sciences and humanities. In contrast, German emigrants, even those of Jewish descent, were at first looked at suspiciously as enemy aliens who formed a security threat. This policy changed in 1943, when the OSS leadership realized what kind of an asset the United States had in the German refugee scholars and their knowledge of German society and politics, of the country's regional differences, and finally, of course, of German language. Thus, in 1943, Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer were recruited to work for the Research and Analysis Branch and its legendary Central European section in Washington, D.C. The focus area of this section was naturally Germany and the countries it had occupied in the war. The Central European section consisted of around 40 analysts. 3 Frankfurt School thinkers quickly acquired leading positions in the organization. Neumann became the director of the entire Central European section, while Marcuse and Kirchheimer worked as highly respected senior analysts. I will here take a brief look at their intellectual biographies, which show clearly that intelligence work was something that was completely new for these Frankfurt School intellectuals. Although they were convinced socialists, they were all first and foremost scholars. Neumann's and Kirchheimer's backgrounds were in law and political theory, and they had studied under some of the most eminent figures of Weimar Germany, such as the legal theorist Carl Schmitt. Marcuse, for his part, was a philosopher who had spent the final years of the Weimar era studying with Martin Heidegger. A figure like Schmitt in 1933 declared his support for Hitler. Neumann and Kirchheimer had done some legal advising for Germany's Social Democratic Party and labor unions in the 1920s, and Marcuse and Neumann had briefly participated in the revolution after World War I. Yet none of them had much explicit political experience before joining the US intelligence service. And of course, we have to mention the years that they spent in New York with the exiled Institute for Social Research from the mid-1930s until the early 40s. Led by Max Horkheimer, after 1933, the Institute had relocated from Frankfurt to New York City and Columbia University. In New York, Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer had significantly contributed to the Institute's multidisciplinary critical analysis of modern capitalist society. Nevertheless, in the early 40s, financial difficulties and some theoretical differences resulted in their departing of ways with the Institute. Horkheimer and Adorno moved to California to write their famous Ruminations on Philosophy of History, or the Dialectic of Enlightenment, while Neumann, Kirchheimer, and Marcuse were forced to look for new jobs elsewhere, which they then soon found in the US foreign intelligence and the OSS. It is interesting that at this time, in 1943-1945, the Americans saw no problem with hiring and collaborating with these emigrant intellectuals, although they were not members of any socialist parties, and in fact were critical both of the Social Democrats and the Communists. They did not hide their socialist leanings. This ideological antagonism, however, only became a problem after the war and with the advent of the Cold War. Before that, the decisive goal was to defeat Hitler, and for this goal, all available talent had to be harnessed. The FBI, it should be mentioned, did carefully scrutinize their backgrounds, but at this point, their socialism was insufficient to prevent them of being hired. This motive to fight against Hitler was, unsurprisingly, wholeheartedly shared by Neumann, Kirchheimer, and Marcuse. In the 1960s, they were sometimes accused by radical student activists that by working for the US intelligence during the war, they somehow compromised their socialist ideals, or that they were sellouts. However, Neumann, Kirchheimer, and Marcuse were never in no way ashamed of this collaboration. No matter how major their misgivings about the United States, the beacon of capitalism, were in other respects, during the war it was clear to them all, as it was for the US authorities, who the greatest enemy was at the present. So how did their intelligence work actually unfold in the Central European section in 1943? Their job was to write reports that offered a detailed picture of the societal, political, economic, and psychological circumstances prevailing in Germany at the time, in the wake of Germany's critical losses in Stalingrad and Tunisia, and after the American landing in Italy, after which the turn of the tide in the war started to favor the Allied. The Frankfurt School thinkers drew on various kinds of sources in composing their reports: European press, German radio broadcasts, information gathered by other OSS posts in Europe, and prisoner of war interrogations. The purpose of their reports was to disclose to the US military leadership what kind of an enemy they were at war with. Ultimately, their reports were expected to locate possible weak links in Germany's totalitarian edifice and possible points of anti-Nazi resistance within the country. Franz Neumann, as the deputy chief of the entire Central European section, was their leading voice. In fact, the interpretive scheme that the Frankfurt School and others as well applied in their assessments of Nazi Germany came largely from Neumann's 1942 book called Behemoth, The Structure and Practice of National Socialism, that he had published just shortly before joining the OSS. Neumann's book was one of the first in-depth and empirically backed analyses of National Socialist Germany, and it was also widely appreciated among American intelligence experts and political elites. And it is also interesting to note from hindsight that although today Neumann is much less well known than Theodor Adorno or Max Horkheimer, in the 1940s, Neumann's Behemoth was by far better known than anything that Horkheimer and Adorno had produced by that time. In his book, Neumann had conceived Nazi Germany as a behemoth, a multi-headed monster, familiar both from Jewish theology and Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, consisting of a sort of a compromise between the Nazi Party, the military, state bureaucracy, and major business leaders. The novelty of Neumann's analysis was that Nazi Germany had little to do with old Prussian militarism or with some proverbial anti-modern Teutonism, as Winston Churchill, for instance, thought. Nazi totalitarianism was a very modern phenomenon in which these four power centers had joined forces against the middle and working classes. What stood out from Neumann's analysis was that this multi-headed monster, powerful as it was inherently tension-ridden. The four power centers had different interests, which could only be harmonized by increasingly aggressive foreign policy and military expansionism. Neumann's book, Behemoth, appeared before the decisive turn of the war tide in 1943, with Stalingrad, Tunisia, and so forth. As Germany's fortune started to look dimmer and dimmer, the Nazi Party drew the conclusion that it had to tighten its grip over its military, bureaucratic, and industrial allies. Thus, in 1943, Heinrich Himmler and the SS assumed a stronger hold of Germany's internal administration, thereby lessening the army's power inside Germany. And Albert Speer was given control of the country's economic development, which further diminished the economic freedom of individual entrepreneurs. As the Nazi leadership itself became increasingly aware that Germany would likely lose the war, it wanted to ensure that the other power centers in Germany would not attempt to rock the boat and secure for themselves a new life in a post-war Germany, as had happened after World War I with the collapse of the German Kaiserreich. Neumann's book had then a considerable authority in the Central European section. Another thing that the section adopted from its three socialist intellectuals was their collaborative way of working, learned at the Frankfurt School Institute in the 1930s. Their approach was indeed collaborative. Every report draft was circulated among the other relevant analysts and then discussed and criticized in a collaborative effort to improve on its weak points. Which is not to say that their work in the Central European section was not without its difficulties. As one of their colleagues described the impression the trio made on their more intellectually sober American colleagues, I quote, "It was as if the left Hegelian Weltgeist had taken up temporary residence in the Central European section of the OSS." End of quote. Indeed, not infrequently, Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer were criticized for towing the line between objective, neutral analysis of facts. This was what they were supposed to do, and a temptation to offer something like policy recommendations informed by their own judgment of things and their social theoretical neo-Marxist perspective that was nurtured by their experiences in the Weimar Republic and especially their years with the Frankfurt School in New York. In 1944, Germany's defeat in World War II looked a more and more inevitable scenario in the eyes both of the Allied and the German leadership. At this time, the intelligence analysts at the OSS and the Central European section began to pay more attention to the questions of how Nazi Germany would eventually collapse and how Germany should be treated after the war. In the Frankfurt School thinkers' account of Nazi Germany that was outlined in Franz Neumann's book Behemoth and that we just examined in the previous section, Nazi totalitarianism was a peculiar compromise between the Nazi Party and the country's military, administrative, and industrial elites. From this account of the enemy, there ensued certain policy recommendations with respect to the question of what an effective war strategy against Germany that was pushed on the defensive should look like. Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer were all of the opinion that in 1944, as Germany's defeat looked certain, the Allied policy toward Germany should do its best to shorten the war as much as possible, as well as support democratic forces within Germany. With this hope, they were in full agreement with the Central European section in general. There was a solid consensus among the section's analysts that while military defeat of Germany and the Axis powers was a necessary precondition to destroy Nazism, the Allies should try to support and work alongside Germany's anti-Nazi resistance. This was crucial because it was the only way to cast a solid foundation for democratic politics in Germany in the long term. The Central European section and the Frankfurt School intellectuals within it was firmly against the idea that Germany should face an unconditional surrender and thereby lose its national sovereignty and unity. In the estimate of Neumann and other analysts at the Central European section, the policy of unconditional surrender was counterproductive. By talking about such harsh measure, the Allied leaders were playing into the hands of Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. Goebbels could more easily persuade Germans to think that Germany's unconditional defeat in the war would mean horrible things for German civilians. This fear would only serve to prolong the war and make Germans more willing to accept the Nazi demand to fight until the bitter end, no matter what. Now, especially useful for the Nazi propaganda in 1944 was the so-called Morgenthau Plan, which favored an extremely punitive approach to Germany. This plan was introduced in 1944 by Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of Treasury in Roosevelt's administration. Had it been executed, Germany, as the initial aggressor in the war, would have been forced on its knees by destroying its industrial infrastructure. The plan was, however, abandoned, as it was realized that it would cause a famine that would kill millions of German civilians. The Central European section stood firmly against such plans from the beginning. In its estimate, the Allies should rather seek to identify and cooperate with anti-Nazi forces that resided within Germany. But where was such anti-Nazi resistance to be found in Germany? In this question, the three Frankfurt School thinkers thought very differently than many of their colleagues, and especially the US elites more generally. Many people in the US set their hopes in Germany's conservative circles, especially the Prussian Junkers and the army leadership. The critical theorists, however, contended that this was a wrong path. They maintained that conservatives had been co-opted by the Nazis to ensure that they did not abandon the ship while it was sinking. They also worried the implication that such a conservative coup, as happened in July 1944, would have for post-war Germany. In their estimation, it would restore to its place one of the cornerstones of the Nazi behemoth, namely the conservative circles who controlled the army. A post-war Germany led by conservatives would also mean bad things for international peace, as the conservatives desired to make Germany a militant bulwark against the Soviet Union. In the estimate of Neumann and his Frankfurt School fellows, resistance against the Nazi regime from ordinary people was not to be expected either. Indeed, they claimed that psychological warfare was of no use in this war, not because ordinary Germans would have believed in the Nazi propaganda, but because in a totalitarian country, they simply had no other choice than to go along, no matter how considerable their animosity against the Nazi system may have been. Where did then the Frankfurt School thinkers see a potential anti-Nazi force in Germany? Rather unsurprisingly, they attached their hopes on scattered cells of Germany's workers' parties and trade unions that had been operating underground since 1933. In their estimate, these remnants of the German workers' movement were the force that the Allies should try to assist. Not only would the socialist underground help the Allies to defeat Hitler from within Germany, it would also form a potential foundation for a democratic Germany in the post-Nazi era. Democratic socialism was the political arrangement and a key word that the three critical theorists hoped would become reality in Germany after the war. In this kind of democratic socialism, unlike in the Soviet Union, civic liberties of liberal political tradition would be in full force. In their estimate, it was a likely scenario that even the German communists would support such an arrangement and accept a minimal program that would safeguard individual rights and liberties. A more recent discovery, and a rather startling one at that, is that during the war, Franz Neumann was a Soviet spy. In the 1990s, declassified Soviet intelligence files disclosed Neumann as the codename Ruff. Neumann was apparently not very popular among the Soviets, for he often frustrated them by being passive and not really delivering what was expected. The scholarly examination of Neumann's motives has suggested that he leaked this information in order to advance policies regarding Germany that he thought were wiser than the ones the American intelligence leadership actually advocated. The issue came down to the question of which groups in Germany the Allies should try to support to overthrow the Hitler regime. The OSS leadership favored the conservative circles that in July 1944 actually attempted a coup. Neumann, in contrast, wished to see a wider resistant movement comprising of workers. Now, there is no evidence indicating that Neumann would have wanted post-war Germany to become anything like a Soviet-style communism. But apparently he reasoned that by leaking to the Soviets important Western intelligence material would serve his own long-term dream of Germany's becoming a democratic socialist country. Intimately related to this question of what sort of a country post-war Germany was supposed to become was the question of what kind of a denazification process Germany needed and should undergo after the war in order to become a genuinely democratic country. It was again Neumann's behemoth that formed an important lens through which the three emigrant socialists approached this question. For Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer, it was not enough to indict and try Hitler, Himmler, and a handful of other Nazi leaders at the very top of the criminal system. This was in keeping with their conviction that National Socialism was a far larger and deeper phenomenon than the mere Nazi Party. As Neumann had argued in Behemoth, it also involved Germany's military, industrial, and bureaucratic elites. Neumann's conception of Nazi Behemoth as a four-headed monster had a considerable impact on the way the United States initially came to think about this process of transforming German society. This initial approach was summarized as the famous 4 Ds. These were denazification, democratization, demilitarization, and decartelization. Each of these procedures, as one can easily see, was aimed at a specific power group that Neumann had singled out in Behemoth. First, denazification, in a more limited sense, was supposed to destroy the Nazi Party. Democratization involved not only introduction of parliamentarism, but also profound changes in the way Germany recruited and educated its civil servants. Demilitarization was supposed to bring down the German army, the Wehrmacht. And decartelization, finally, was intended to abolish the country's economic structure that had resulted in unhealthy monopolization. Of course, this significant convergence in the visions of the Frankfurt School and the United States occupation authorities did not last very long. With the advent of the Cold War, the United States gave up on its policy of 4 Ds. As the Soviet Union and the Red Danger became its guiding concern, West Germany's geopolitical status changed as well. As the country was needed as an anti-communist bulwark against its eastern neighbor, the United States opted for a very different stance toward the denazification process. The US passed the denazification over to the Germans themselves, with the result that the Adenauerian West Germany soon ended the very process and let former Nazis off the hook. Again, the planned civil service reform was soon abandoned, as was demilitarization with the rearmament of West Germany. Economic restructuring of Germany too came up short, with the reconsolidation of its largest banks and industrial enterprises. This was in tune with the United States' general strategy of building a relationship of trust not with the German socialists, as the Frankfurt School had hoped, but with its Christian democratic political center. This was a move that it was expected would both put an end to Germany's aggressive imperialist aspirations and keep the danger of communism in check. With this geopolitical turn of the tide, the Frankfurt School thinkers' emphasis on a more pervasive transformation of German society was thus forsaken, and their concern with the institutional and societal preconditions of the Holocaust were brushed under the carpet. However, the Frankfurt School's contribution to the fight against Hitler and National Socialism did not end with the end of the war in May 1945. Indeed, one of the most memorable episodes in Neumann's, Kirchheimer's, and Marcuse's years with the OSS came only after the war. The final contribution that the three Frankfurt School intellectuals made in their war against Nazi Germany took place as the preparation of the Nuremberg trials against Nazi war criminals. The Nuremberg trials were held between November 1945 and October 1946 in the city of Nuremberg in southeast German state of Bavaria. Initially, the Allies had been undecided about how to treat the Nazi war criminals. Were they to be dealt with in a summary fashion under military law, or was the more proper, indeed more civilizational solution to hold them legally accountable and indict and try them in an internationally sanctioned tribunal? The latter route was ultimately agreed upon, and to this end the four Allied powers founded an international military tribunal in August 1945. In Nuremberg, the United States chief prosecutor was the former Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson. Significantly, the OSS was commissioned to assist Justice Jackson and his team in the preparation of the trials. A central role in this assistant task was given to the Central European section, led by Neumann. The section's analysts, Marcuse and Kirchheimer among them, worked hard to gather all available empirical information concerning the Nazi plans for world domination and persecution and extermination of European Jews to be used by the prosecution. The Frankfurt School's impact on the Nuremberg trials, however, was visible also on the more conceptual level. Franz Neumann played a key role in the International Military Tribunal's articulation of its case against the Nazis. Neumann helped draft the indictments against 22 leading Nazi defendants. These culminated in the charges known as the famous Counts 1 through to 4, crimes against peace or waging an aggressive war, traditional war crimes, crimes against humanity, meaning the extermination of the Jews, and finally a conspiracy or a common plan to commit these crimes. These charges are well expressed in a preliminary draft written by the Central European section in the preparation of the trials. This draft carried the imprint of Neumann's book Behemoth when it stated that, I quote, "It is the purpose of the prosecution to demonstrate the existence of a common plan or enterprise of the German government, the Nazi Party, and the German military, industrial, and financial leaders to achieve world domination by war." End of quote. What this draft also brought to the fore, however, was Neumann's peculiar understanding of the role of anti-Semitism in Nazism and ultimately in the Holocaust. The draft continued by arguing that the destruction of the Jewish people as a whole, although an end in itself, was at the same time linked to and closely tied up with this aim of world conquest. End of quote. What was expressed here was Neumann's so-called spearhead theory of anti-Semitism. He had introduced it already in Behemoth in 1942. In his estimate, the extermination of the European Jews was more a byproduct of the Nazis' larger plan for world mastery than it was an ideological objective in its own right. Significantly, in Nuremberg trials, Neumann's interpretation of anti-Semitism was repeated almost word for word by the Justice Jackson in his opening speech. He said that, I quote, "Anti-Semitism has been aptly credited with being a spearhead of terror. The ghetto was the laboratory for testing repressive measures. Jewish property was the first to be expropriated, but the custom grew and included similar measures against anti-Nazi Germans, Poles, Czechs, Frenchmen, and Belgians. Extermination of the Jews enabled the Nazis to bring a practiced hand to similar measures against Poles, Serbs, and Greeks. The plight of the Jew was a constant threat to opposition or discontent among other elements of Europe's population: pacifists, conservatives, communists, Catholics, Protestants, socialists. it was in fact a threat to every dissenting opinion and to every non-Nazi's life. End of quote. In Neumann's spearhead theory of anti-Semitism was a key to Nazi totalitarianism. But he interpreted it in opportunistic or economistic terms as a means to an end, rather than as an obsessive worldview from which all other Nazi goals resulted. As Neumann had written in his book, quote, "Measures against the Jews are always the spearhead for general oppression, the domestic testing ground for universal terrorist methods directed against all those groups and institutions that are not fully subservient to the Nazi system." End of quote. According to Neumann's theory, the Nazis needed an enemy that would unite otherwise antagonistic social groups whose interests worked at cross purposes. Jews were chosen to play this role of a common enemy for various reasons. They were societally sufficiently weak and would not cause a serious threat to the regime, unlike, for example, the Catholics, who would be defended by the powerful Catholic Church, which would cause serious troubles for the Nazis. Again, the confiscation of Jewish property would appeal to the lower middle classes and thereby give the Nazis the support of a significant demographic group. That Jews lived in all countries also made anti-Semitism a tool with which to mobilize allies in other countries. And finally, the anti-Semitic propaganda image of Jews as being a powerful presence everywhere served as a justification for the Nazi occupation of other countries. Sometimes Neumann and other analysts at the Central European section, and indeed the OSS at large, have been criticized for ignoring or belittling the Holocaust as it was happening in 1943 and 1944. The analysts at the Central European section were indeed aware, through intelligence information at their disposal, of the Nazi atrocities, of the violence and terror, of mass deportations, and of what was going on in various concentration camps. But still they seemed unable to draw the conclusion of the real magnitude of what was taking place and how systematic it in actual fact was. There was, in other words, a gap between the information that they had in front of them and interpretations that they were able to draw from it. In this, Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer were not alone. Others too in the Central European section later recall how, although horrendous information from Europe was coming in 1943 and 1944 especially, it took months for them to actually realize what this information meant. This all may be hard to understand from today's perspective, but back then the Holocaust was something largely unprecedented. We, in contrast, live on this side of history and World War II. We have had time to absorb not only the Holocaust, but also other genocides in Rwanda, the Balkans, and elsewhere. Another reason that has been suggested for Neumann's and the others' disbelief is their experience of World War I, when there was a lot of lies and propaganda about war crimes allegedly committed by the opposing countries and their armies. And so this may have been another reason for their slowness or incapability to believe all the information that they had received from Germany and its occupied territories in the East. Neumann and others have also been criticized for their stubborn allegiance, even after the war, to the spearhead theory of anti-Semitism. Now, there were probably various reasons for this. Yet one reason is that this theory allowed Neumann, as well as Marcuse and Kirchheimer, all of whom were Marxists, to keep alive something of their faith in reason, progress, and Western civilization. They were simply unwilling to accept the idea that anti-Semitism was not a pragmatic tool in the service of some other end, no matter how sick that end may have been, such as the reaching world domination. This was for them such a crazy idea, pure irrationality, that they had to find a better explanation. It was easier for Neumann and his colleagues to conceive Nazi anti-Semitism as a functional tool that the fanatic Nazi party and power-hungry German elites, the behemoth, used to gain mastery within Germany and outside of it. Indeed, Neumann's theory enabled them to keep alive not only their trust in reason, it also enabled them to keep alive their trust in the German working class, and to some extent ordinary Germans more generally. As Neumann had written already in his Behemoth, quote, "The writer's personal conviction, paradoxical as it may seem, is that the German people are the least anti-Semitic of all." End of quote. This was his and his Frankfurt School colleagues' opinion also after 1945. The German people were not inherently anti-Semitic. they had rather been ideologically manipulated, co-opted, or forced to contribute to the Holocaust. Such difficult reflections on the nature of Nazism and the Holocaust have, of course, become, in the past 70+ years, a central concern in the historiography of modern Germany, as well as genocide studies more generally. Scholars working on these areas ask questions such as how big of a role did anti-Semitic ideology play in the extermination of the Jews? And what role, on the other hand, should we accord to other, say, economic calculations, or unplanned and uncoordinated developments brought about by the nature of the Nazi system and the context of the World War? Related to these later historiographical debates, it is an interesting fact that the pioneer of the so-called functionalist or non-ideological interpretation of the Holocaust, Raoul Hilberg, was Franz Neumann's doctoral student in Columbia University in the 1950s. To conclude, the OSS was shut down in October 1945, and the research and analysis branch was first moved to the State Department and finally closed in 1946. The rapidly changed political climate was an important factor behind this change, as the Cold War between the West and the East emerged as the decisive political reality, reflected by the founding of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, in 1947. The three critical theorists realized that as socialists, they were beginning to be perceived as a problem rather than valuable collaborators to a common cause. Hence, Franz Neumann left the government service in 1947 and became professor of political science at Columbia University. He also played a key role in the creation of the Free University of Berlin. In 1954, at the height of his fame in the United States and West Germany, he died in a car accident in Switzerland. Herbert Marcuse and Otto Kirchheimer continued to work for the State Department well into the 1950s, where they, as socialists, were under continuous surveillance by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. In 1955, Kirchheimer became professor of political science at the New School of Social Research. Marcuse, on his part, was appointed professor of philosophy at Brenda University, where he developed his famous Freudian Marxist synthesis that would ultimately make him the father figure of the New Left in the 1960s. What was the Frankfurt School's impact on the United States' first centralized foreign intelligence agency, the OSS, during World War II? It would be an overstatement to say that the Frankfurt School had much influence on the Allied policies or the outcome of the World War. Yet it would be equally erroneous to conclude that their impact was non-existent. We have seen in this presentation how pivotal Franz Neumann's 1942 book, Behemoth, was among the Central European section's analysts, and beyond it, with its depiction of the structure of Nazi Germany and its totalitarian system. We have also seen how the Frankfurt School's recommendations for post-war denazifications initially converged with those of the United States, even as this convergence soon gave way to antagonistic positions defined by the emerging Cold War. Finally, we have seen how the Frankfurt School contributed, both empirically and conceptually, to the Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 46 against the Nazi war criminals. And so, however one may assess and weigh the importance of Neumann's, Kirchheimer's, and Marcuse's contributions to the fight against National Socialism, their work for the OSS in the Central European section remains an important politically active episode in the history of the Frankfurt School, a school that, despite its ultimately political motivations, more often than not chose to channel its energies to unpolitical efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikko. Thank you for this excellent presentation. And now I just ask you to stop sharing the screen so we can see our discussants, which are waiting for their questions. I'm sure they have a lot of questions and comments. So please, I would ask Annarita to start if it's okay for you.
Yeah, sure. I can start.
We can hear you. Okay.
First of all, I would like to thank Giovanni Bernardini and Camurri, and of course the Center of European Studies for promoting this seminar series and for inviting me to discuss these very fascinating papers. So very well done. I was fascinated by your work. As Giovanni said before, I am working on a project about cultural diplomacy and soft power activities of both these dictatorships in the US. Specifically, I'm focusing on the role played by national icons such as Our Lady of Fatima in rebranding the regime's image and promoting an anti-communist alliance between Portugal and the US under the umbrella of the NATO during the immediate after World War II. So I'm quite familiar to the context, but I read your paper as a profane because I'm not very on deep on the Frankfurt School, but I know quite the context about the post-World War II and US policy. Your paper, Mikko, made me think that when we talk about international relationships, we can view them as a multi-layered dynamic that encompasses the traditional and official levels of diplomacy, the semi-structured level of cultural diplomacy and soft power activities, and the work of secret agencies. So to have a very complex dynamics of how relationship works, these three layers are very, they have to consider as a whole. This also highlights that in this scenario, both culture and social sciences have played a pivotal role, more than what people typically expect. And with that in mind, allow me to make pop cultural references. Last year, the Christopher Nolan new movie, Oppenheimer, achieved a huge success in terms of audience and critical acclaim. As we all know, the movie is based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography written by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin, and brings to the attention of the general public the importance of the academic physics diaspora in the US in developing the Manhattan Project. Probably this movie will win the Oscar for the Best Picture, and Cillian Murphy possibly winning the best role as leading actor playing Oppenheimer. 10 years earlier, another movie about the importance of academic contribution, this time focusing on the main character, Alan Turing, in decrypting Nazi cipher messages, was released. The Imitation Game received good reviews and also won an Oscar for the best adapted screenplay. Both stories are fascinating, and when I read your abstract and now listen to your presentation, both came into my mind because your papers show in a certain way a similar case. However, in your case studies, the academics that you referred are not from the art sciences, but rather from the field of social sciences. They are philosophers, sociologists, law experts, and political theorists. Three unorthodox Marxists and critical theorists, Franz Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, and Herbert Marcuse. I think that your paper is important because it makes clear the significance of such disciplines in the civil society. This was your conclusion of your paper. Of course, the soldiers won the war, but social scientists gave their helps too, and underscore our culture as well as social scientists contributing in a critical juncture in our history as the end of the World War II was. In your presentation, you mentioned that these scholars, along with other European emigres, deal with three series of problems while they work for the Central European section within Research and Analysis branch of the Office of Strategic Services. To defeat the Nazi Germany, that was a priority at that time, the planning of a post-Hitler Germany, and drafting the charges against the Nazis in Nuremberg. In my commentary, I will try to follow your paper suggestion and your paper structure and give you some thoughts and suggestions. But I would also ask you for more information because your paper leaves me with intellectual curiosity to know more about this space that, as you said, it will remain overshadowed for a long time. After that, after discuss briefly this three section of your paper, I will also try to provide you with some general thoughts, most focusing on the historical methodology, that the part that I think in which I can contribute more. So the first part of your presentation deals with the unpolitical role of Frankfurt School and the defeating of Nazi Germany. In your paper, you claim that the common perception of the Frankfurt School was by and large an apolitical phenomenon, and you recognize that during the short period, scholars that worked in failed to unite theory and practice. You also suggest that despite this common interpretation, they largely influenced European faith. Particularly, Adorno's theory had a significant impact on the political and cultural democratization of West Germany in 1950 and 60. So I would like to ask you if you did not consider or mention, at least you mentioned very briefly at the end of your presentation, the impact of Marcuse's speculation in the post-World War II era, especially its influence on the 1968 movement, because you deemed it outside the scope of this paper, or if you think it was less relevant. Additionally, I would also like to inquire for what reason you place Marcuse among that you call the less famous figure, and did not consider him as a prominent as Adorno or Keimer, when I think he actually had a strong impact on the history of philosophy and in the future of the social movement. And as a final consideration on this point, I also find it very interesting that the OSS recruited exiled figures, among whom there were also prominent left-wing sympathizers, former members of Social Communist Party, and in the case of your presentation, openly supporters of the Marxist theory. Additionally, you claim also the Neumann works and Nazi structure as a behemoth was better known at that time in the US compared to the Leviathan theory proposed by Adorno. In this regard, it could be interesting to know more, and that you could better explain why and how Marcuse, Neumann, and Keimer were recruited by the US government. Why them and not other German intellectual philosophers? And if there are other Jewish German intellectuals that work at the OSS in the same time. Finally, I also have a question about how it actually was their work at the OSS. Besides, they work on a level of analysis of discourses, what they do with the clip papers and radio broadcaster that you mentioned. They analyze the discourse, they try to follow some cultural tendencies and political tendencies that they write in their report. So how works they on the OSS office? Regarding the second part, the plans for the post-Nazi Germany, it sounds very interesting that the OSS not only worked to define Nazi Germany, but also to start to develop a plan for the post-World War era. In this sense, I feel I really like your paper also because last week I went to Madrid to see a very interesting exhibition called The Divided World that is hosted in the Canal Foundation, and a deal about the reconstruction of the new world starting from the Berlin. And I found very interesting that all the exhibition was very well, it's very well constructed actually, but not mention the effort of social scientists and philosophers in the reconstruction of this new world. So your paper gives another perspective on what I just saw in Madrid. In this sense, I would like to ask you to provide us with more information about three aspects that I would like to know more in this section of your presentation. The first aspect concerns the internal debate within the OSS about the future that German deserve. You mentioned two main lines of thought: the Morgenthau plan and the one proposed by Marcuse, Neumann, and Keimer. Could you elaborate on whether these lines underwent changes and reshaping during the course of 1944 and 45, according to the rapid changes in the international scenario? And the second aspect is about the personal ideological path and maybe struggles that Marcuse, Neumann, and Keimer, as Marxist theorists, could have experienced in promoting an anti-communist solution to Germany. democratic socialists could be considered as a form of solve and take together these two tendencies. Still regarding the background of the three protagonists of your paper, I'm also interested in learning more about their perception regarding the control that the US government exerted over them, and how these feelings have or not have an impact on their work and production. A final question is about the follow-up or the service for the OSS. You said that Marcuse and Pirkheimer confronted some criticism and did not regret of their work at the OSS, but I would be interested also to know what was their opinion on the results and the choices that OSS and the US government took in the immediately post-World War period. Did they agree or did they criticize it? Finally, did have any role in designing the immediate post-World War propaganda discourse regarding the German division? Because I still in mind this poster campaign and propaganda campaign that I saw in this exhibition, and I would like to know more about if they had contributed to this part of also a propaganda for the division of Germany too. And additionally, if you see any long-term influence of their work on the Berlin question. The Nuremberg trials were, as you very well explained, were not just trials for justice, but as we all know, they are also trials that concern a political system and an entire political conception embodied by the Nazi plan for world domination. You wrote that Neumann's concept of a spread theory of anti-Semitism had a huge impact on the trial and was chosen as the primary references, despite Adorno putting more emphasis on the anti-Semitism on his work. In your opinion, was this choice by the International Military Tribunal influenced by a lesser knowledge of Adorno theorization, or it was a deliberate decision? And just to conclude, I also would like to give you general comments about your paper. As I mentioned previously, I found your paper super interesting with an interdisciplinary approach, nicely situated at the crossroad of intellectual history, international relations, political theory, and philosophy. In this regard, I also encounter some difficulties because primary is not a topic that I'm deeply familiar with in placing your research within the existing literature. I would like to ask you if you conduct your research in order that it was more associated with the internal dynamics among what you refer to the better known faction of Frankfurt School and the one that has remained more in the shadows, or does it offer a new insight into the utilization of social sciences in the international relations process, or perhaps it is neither of these? And finally, as you say, the OSS papers were made available in 2008, and the contribution of Neumann, Marcuse, and Pirkheimer has been published recently. However, given the rich nature of your research, I believe that you have cross-referenced more sources and archives across German and US. And therefore, I would like to ask you which archive you have consulted and what methodology you have constructed and utilized for your research. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annarita. Thank you for your questions and comments. Now it's Maurizio's turn, so we wait for you, and then if you don't mind, I think it's better for Mikko to reply to all the questions and comments at the end. So Maurizio, please. Is it okay for you, Mikko? Okay, perfect.
Okay.
So thank you, Maurizio.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to thank Giovanni and Renato for inviting me in this seminar, and thank you, Mikko, for this brilliant presentation. I will try to examine a couple of aspects that I find particularly interesting in this reconstruction, and I will ask a few questions on some of the many topics that his analysis touched on.
First, however, I think it's correct to explain my point of view on this topic. So where do I speak from? From what study experiences? I'm not a specialist in intellectual history of exile, but in different periods of my studies, I devoted some attention to the cultural and biographical paths of some intellectuals of Jewish origin who fled the Nazi fury. So I devoted some research to Walter Benjamin, who had, as we know, a very intense relationship with the Frankfurt School, to Hans Kelsen, one of the most important legal scholars of the century, who fled from Europe to USA, to Hermann Heller, one of the most brilliant German legal scholars of the 20s and 30s, who fled Frankfurt because of his Jewish origin and his socialist sympathies. I later worked on the topic of the legacies of the Weimar legal culture in the years of the democratic revival in post-World War II Germany, and naturally examine the influence that the intellectual production of immigrants to the USA had on the political culture of the Bonn Republic. This is why I find Mikko's research very, very interesting, because it allowed me to look at this matter from a different point of view, a singular point of view. I'm familiar with Laudani's research on the reports written for US intelligence, but some details were missing from me. So I'd like to point out a few issues that I think are useful to emphasize. The issue of the influence of intellectuals on political and social reality is a classic problem. This paper offered us an original viewpoint about thought that becomes action. An action that we may not be able to call political in the strict sense, but which has obvious political implications. I have always read Neumann's and Frankel theories on the Nazi state as important chapters in the history of political thought. It's only in more recent times that I have paid more attention to the historical, not only cultural function of those reflections. Mikko's research shows very clearly the transformative potential that theoretical and political reflection had in those years, helping to define interpretative frameworks and mental patterns that deeply influenced historical processes. The case of Behemoth's influence on the choices of American intelligence, the Zanifications projects, and the preparation of the Nuremberg trials seems to me very, very important. Michael Scholles, a great German legal historian, often recalled that ideas are historical facts. He said this in polemic against those who attributed to little value to the role of ideas and the history of thought over the history of legal norms and institutions. Ideas and interpretations developed by intellectuals have the capacity to shape the reality. In the case of Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer reports offers a very clear confirmation of the performative role of intellectual activity in the governance of historical processes. A second element of great interest highlighted by Mikko's analysis concerned the risk of anachronism. This is a topic that historians consider obvious, but we always run the risk of interpreting the past in the light of what came later. The paper gives us more than one occasion to reflect on these aspects. At first glance, it's curious to know that American intelligence uses scholars of the Marxist belief, even if declined in an unorthodox way. How is it possible, we may ask, that such an important part of the intellectual elaboration on the German condition and the post-war future was entrusted to scholars who a few years later would be regarded with suspicion for their political positions? The same applies to the question of Neumann's theory of anti-Semitism as the spearhead of Hitlerism and his apparent underestimation of the Holocaust. Nikos rightly relativizes these impressions, historically contextualizing the issues and showing the maybe far from mysterious reasons for the collaboration of Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer in the Office of Strategic Services. The same can be said for the question of the interpretation of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Decades of Holocaust studies risk affecting our view of the thoughts and actions of the men who analyzed the phenomenon between 1943 and 45. Analyzing the disruptive value of that interpretation and the effects on the Allies post-war management is much more important than retrospective criticism of what Neumann underestimated or failed to understand. An examination of the circumstances in which the collaboration with intelligence and the interpretation of Nazism emerged makes everything, I think, clearer. I turn to a few considerations and questions. In your paper, Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer form a very coherent group. They are a team that you analyze in a quite unitary way. Yet they have quite different paths and biographies, which it would be interesting to recall. Neumann is a student like Ernst Fraenkel of Hugo Sinzheimer, the founder of German labor law and extraordinary important figure in Weimar, Germany. Kirchheimer is a pupil of Carl Schmitt, himself a leading figure, as you said, in the intellectual and legal debate of the Weimar period, Nazi Germany and post-World War Germany. Marcuse studied with Heidegger, another crucial intellectual in German public life, and as controversial as Schmitt for his adherence to Nazism. They are different biographical and intellectual stories, who for perhaps similar reasons, also linked to economic necessity, found themselves working together. The ability to collaborate and their discussions are legendary. But can you tell us more about the differences between the three intellectuals? How does the approach to the study of the same issues diverge? How did the collaboration evolve? Can we think of it as the result of a multi-voice dialogue? And what influence did this experience have on the construction of their later career trajectories? A small curiosity, I mentioned Schmitt, as I said, a central figure in the German debate between the 20s and the 80s. Kirchheim studied with him, Neumann's choice of a Hobbesian figure, behemoth, to describe the Nazi state, brings to mind Schmidt's rehabilitation of Hobbes' Leviathan during the 20s. In many of the discussion in the legal political culture of the time, Schmidt is the stone guest. What idea did you have of Schmidt's work from the other side of the ocean? Are Schmidt's categories present in the debates between Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer? How did Kirchheimer distance himself for his mentor? Then there is a question of reflection on the Germany of the so-called Stunde Null, the 0 hour, the hour zero. The choice of denazification is very clear. The three intellectuals also help to prepare lists of influential people to be cut from the important points of the institutions. But there is a consideration of the risk of resetting the state machine, the state, to zero. How do they address the issue of the continuity of German state? What role does the Weimar experience play in their theoretical elaborations? Is a return to Weimar possible or a taboo? Perhaps their surprise at the Americans' choice to look to Adenauer's CDU to found the new course of German democracy, leaving the socialist parties on the sideline, tell us something about their devotion to the political culture system of the Weimar period, the OSS leadership and the three intellectuals. Was it necessary to adapt critical theory to make it suitable for the governmental context? The cultural and professional approach of the intelligence leader was profoundly different from theirs. They put a lot of faith in the reflection of Neumann, Marcuse, and Kirchheimer, but how did these Jewish Germans with Marxist sympathies actually see it? How did their dialogue unfold? I come now to a final question related to the field of research and its possible developments. I'm not an expert of the topic, but there are some studies on this subject. And can you tell us something about the state of research on this specific topic and the originality of your approach to the study of this phenomenon? It emerged from our previous dialogues that there is considerable archival work to be done to reconstruct the role that emigrant intellectuals played in the construction of democratic Germany. Can you tell us something about the recent development of these studies and your role in this debate and the elements that historical research still needs to explore? So many questions, I know, maybe too many questions. Okay, thank you, Mikko, for your paper and for your attention.
Thank you, Maurizio. Actually, Mikko, I'm afraid there are two discussants has taken their role very seriously, and you have a lot of very interesting and insightful questions to reply. I'm not sure you will reply to all before the end of the seminar, but anyway, start whenever you want. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Annarita and Maurizio, for these brilliant points and excellent questions. There are indeed quite a few of them, and I can feel myself already digesting, absorbing them, and all together and intermingling. But I try to, I probably cannot answer all of them. But first, maybe I should say something about the background of this presentation and its relation to my work that I've done and the new project that Maurizio just mentioned. So this presentation was pretty much an overview of the certain historical topic. It's not yet so much my own contribution or argument regarding it. It's something or relates to a project that I've been working on, planning or sketching a project since last May or June, I think. So it's still in very early stages, this project, and I will say something about this project later, but I will first touch on these other questions. I think, Annarita, yeah, you brought up essential things about this, but I claimed that Adorno and Marcuse, that they would not have been, as especially Marcuse, a pop, that how can one conceive him or call him a not well-known figure of the Frankfurt School figures, when he in fact was probably, I think, in the 60s and 70s, the most best-known philosopher of the world for a few years. So that was not my intention. Maybe I have just tried to frame my case, and well, I do have a personal experience. I did wrote some academic thesis a long time ago on Marcuse, and my supervisor asked me, like, he was overwhelmed. Why on earth would you want to study Marcuse? And well, I explained to him, and then in the seminar, my fellow students, none of them had heard about Marcuse. So this experience may be in the back of my head that I assume that people don't know him that well anymore. There is, one can say that there is a Adorno Renaissance or something like that, but with Marcuse, he's still perhaps more marginal, but definitely, in the overall history of the Frankfurt School in the 20th century intellectual history, he should be definitely included with Adorno and Horkheimer. And another point that you mentioned, yeah, I should have mentioned that in the beginning when I said that I'm going to introduce this politically active episode in the history of the Frankfurt School. And then I contrasted that with the dialectic of enlightenment and Horkheimer and Adorno. Of course, one should not belittle the work that these two figures, especially Adorno, did in the 50s before he became famous and kind of this celebrated inspirator behind the radical student movement. It's not necessarily political per se, but he worked in the university politics and was a very visible public intellectuals engaged in, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of TV, radio lectures or lectures elsewhere. So that could, his work in the 50s and how he worked and in some ways also succeeded in strengthening the West Germany's democratic political culture after the devastations of the Nazi dictatorship. That should definitely be included if one writes a history of the political contributions of the Frankfurt School. And same, of course, goes with Marcuse. Marcuse's work in the 1960s, all the influence that he had on the student movement and the 1960s cultural scene in more generally. As for my background, yeah, in my previous studies, they have, as Giovanni mentioned in the beginning, they have both been about this, what I consider better known Frankfurt School, about Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, and very specific intellectual historical topics. Intellectual history, in some would say in an old-fashioned way, is where I come from. I've studied their what I see as their overlooked relationships with certain conservative figures. In the first book, I focused on their reception of Heidegger before Heidegger declared his Nazism in 1933. And in the second book that will probably come out later this year, I focused on Adorno and his indebtedness to figures like Oswald Spengler and the other figures of the conservative revolution of the 1920s. A very controversial claim, I know, but I just bring that up to say where I come from and how this present project of which this presentation is a part. With the new project, I try to kind of widen my scope and come up with a larger research project. It's not focused on a handful of well-known names, all of them males. In the new project, I focus, I still haven't made any definite decisions, but probably 15 or 20 a very diverse group of German Jewish figures who fled to the Anglophone world, England, United States, half of them women probably. And the idea behind this project, which I emphasize is a very much work in progress, is that I have I have a feeling that oftentimes we know these legendary illustrious immigrants, Adorno and Hannah Arendt, and many of these famous names, but I think that somehow conveys a false image of the diversity that there was in many ways. And the perspective that I will use in this new project is to investigate what they thought about Germany, beginning with these years that I have focused here now, the last war years, and probably until the mid-16th, at the end of the Adenauer era and the Auschwitz trial. So that's the rationale behind this new working project. And as for Maurizio's points, there are rather many of them, but I think I mentioned the Adorno Renaissance that I think has been going on for the past years. There's something similar happening with Neumann and Kirchheimer, that scholars in the Frankfurt School tradition think, mostly philosophers or political scientists, that there was a chance for a different critical theory that was missed when these people were still alive. And these people mean that the works of Neumann and Kirchheimer, they contain seeds of this critical theory of politics, which kind of carve a different path, that they are not left-wing Schmittianism. This is my perception of Kirchheimer, that he distanced himself forcefully from Schmitt in his writings. And so what this critical theory of politics would be, that it would also stand at a distance from the best-known Frankfurt School, the original Horkheimerian Freudo-Marxist synthesis, let alone the philosophy of history of dialectic of enlightenment, that have very little to say about concrete political events. So I think the Kirchheimer-Schmitt question in this respect is very, very relative. And I guess that's also one of my motivations to engage in this kind of work, this Renaissance and new interest in Neumann and Kirchheimer. And I have to admit that these figures, although, I consider myself a historian of the Frankfurt School, I have not, before this project, dedicated much serious research on them. So many angles intersecting here that I try to, in my new project, somehow bring together. What else? The Weimar question that Maurizio brought up is, I have to admit, it's essential and very relevant, but at this point, I can only come up with one anecdote. You said, or compared these positions, well, the OSS leadership and the circles in the United States in general, they tried to help the German Christian conservatives, the Adenauerian party. I think, if I remember correctly, during the war, Neumann and his other Frankfurt School fellows, they thought that when they wanted to support German left, German socialist movement, and what was left of it in the underground movement, they included the old Catholic Center Party in this. And I can't remember any details about this, but I remember it was in one of those reports contained in Laudani's book, but that's something that should definitely be considered further. And another point, I think, you asked Maurizio about the differences between these three figures. Again, I admit that I have treated them very as a collective. Maybe the background is that I have tried to, as I emphasized in the beginning, and Annarita also stressed this, that I try to create this. There are two Frankfurt schools. There is the unpolitical dialectic of enlightenment of Horkheimer and Adorno, and then there is this work for the intelligence work during the war. And here my point, I guess I lost my idea here, but where was I? Yeah, there are quite a few questions, and they're all kind of, I'm eager to see what I think about them tomorrow or a week after this, because I definitely need some time to let them sink in. Another historical anecdote, which is not an answer to these questions, unfortunately, is that other German Jewish emigrants who were not Marxists also worked for the US foreign intelligence, and one of them, at least, whom I think I'm going to include in my new project, was Felix Gilbert, a historian and student of Friedrich Meinecke. And I'd be interested in seeing what his archives that were, if I remember correctly, opened only in 2019 in Stanford, in Hoover Institute, what they possibly disclose of their relationship. And more recently, two major names in relation to the Nuremberg trials, Raphael Lemkin and Hersch Lauterbach, have become kind of household names in Holocaust studies, thanks to Philip Sands' East-West Street. And they both worked, at least Lemkin did, for the OSS. And I wonder whether archives where these reports are held, whether there's something on their collaboration or not. That's one avenue that I should definitely look at. I guess in general, one could, if one tries to summarize how this experience during the war for the US foreign intelligence, how it affected their, or did it affect their future intellectual paths or lives? I think this is rather well known too, that of course Marcuse always remained this radical that he has in some sense been since the end of World War I, when he joined or participated in the Spartacist movement of Luxemburg and Liebknecht. And I think in comparison, you can say that Neumann and Kirchheimer, they were more affirmative or appreciated the liberal political tradition more than Marcuse ever did. Marcuse, of course, he was very grateful for the United States that he was able to emigrate, that saved his life. He became an American citizen, and if I understand correctly, he really liked the more easygoing cultural climate of the United States. But he always had this, deep down, he thought that there was something similar to the industrial military complex during the Vietnam War that there was to this, what actually then came to existence in the Adenauer and West Germany. It was always uneasy. This was for him the second best option, liberal democracy. He was, I guess you could say, like Spartacist by heart and a liberal democrat by reason. But yeah, okay, I'm repeating myself. I hope I was able to answer some of these questions, and I have a full of notes here. But I will.
Thank you, Mikko. Thank you for suggesting this very good idea that we may think of, that to have a seminar one day to collect the questions, and then we have a second session the day after, so the speaker has the time to, manage to digest the questions, have better reply. Anyway, I really enjoyed your replies, and I think you said a lot of the things that Maurizio and Annarita asked to you. Now, if there are some more questions, Renato, maybe, or
yes, a very short comment and some question. First of all, I want to underline that my point of view is different from Mikko's point of view, in the sense that I will dedicate my research to the history of exile, mostly from intellectual point of view and in a comparative perspective. I think that using comparison is very important to understand how large, how big is the world of exile, the intellectual and cultural exile in the interwar period. And so from this point of view, I think that could be useful for you to try to enter in this system of exile, and in order to understand better how many differences are inside this system, this world, and how different were the strategies used by the exile in order to escape from Europe, to arrive to the United States, South America too, and also how different was the impact of the European exile in American society, and especially in the American scientific system and in American academia too. So starting from this consideration, from my point of view, the question on unpolitical rule of exile, it isn't an important topic, because it's clear that large part of the European exile had in their activity, American activity, political rules. It's clear, this aspect. So I can give you a large number of different examples from this point of view. So this is the first comment. The second one is that if you enter in this system of exile, and if you try to use the comparison between the different national cases, from German case, French case, Italian case, for example, you can also discover that Frankfurt School and Frankfurt Group, what were only one of the pivotal group inside this world. For example, in the main New York contest, and obviously in the same years, there was an incredible group of intellectuals, social scientists, economists too, working inside the New School for Social Research. And it's very interesting to compare these two different cases and to underline how were the strategy used inside the New School to study the characteristic of the totalitarian system regime, and how they were able to study this step of European history and the rise of totalitarian regime in Italy and also in Germany too. So the suggestion is to open. It's clear your research is absolutely. I think that is too much large, too much big. So I'm going to suggest you to introduce a comparison that it probably could be a risk for you, but I think that it could be, in the meantime, could be useful to have a different point of view regarding some question that you have underlined in your exposition. And so, especially if you want to, and this is the third and the last comment, if you want to study how this group of German Jews has contributed to the rebuilding of Germany after the end of the Second World War. The German case from this point of view is the most complicated inside the history of the exile of European intellectuals, because there are inside the German group a strong division. There were a very complicated relationship between the intellectual German intellectual that decided to stay in Europe and also to stay in Germany too. And so if you consider, for example, the debate between Thomas Mann and the other German intellectual after the end of the Second World War, it's incredible. The strongest battle between Thomas Mann and the other German intellectuals regarding this question. So I think that thinking to this, your principal aim of your research is important to consider this and to try to enter in this system of exile.
Okay, thank you. Please, Mikko.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was also a very rich set of comments and important points there. Yeah, I think the problem that I've had in the past 6 months or eight months, when I've been trying to figure out how many persons or people I wish to include in my study, this has come up earlier too, that this is simply too big. 15, 20, even well, 10 or more people, that's too much. You have to go to too many archives. You have too many overs to kind of absorb and digest. So I really want to listen to carefully what you suggest about cutting down the number of persons involved. And I should mention that the criteria that I have been using when I pick these persons who to include, I don't want my study to become a kind of collection of random case studies. I try to pick these persons so that they were biographically, or well, you could say biographically, there were connections or links between them. And the New York group, not only Frankfurt School is of course one of them, and then the 1950s Germany. There are interesting figures such as Eva Gabriel Reichmann, one of the first author of one of the first scholarly reckonings of the Holocaust, Hostages of Civilization, 1950. She was in touch, corresponded in fact with Max Horkheimer intensively in 1960s and 70s, but not much has been written on her. I think there's one intellectual biography in the progress, but you can't find much about her. And my criteria has been to find these kind of figures, especially women scholars who have been overlooked in the past. And yeah, my impression too is that German situation, as you mentioned, Thomas Mann's debate with this other person, it's very complicated, and that's somehow the area or the problematic that I wish to enter into. But it's difficult to decide and can demarcate who you're going to include. But New School for Social Research, definitely important. I think there's one person that I have already included, a not very well-known sociologist and Weimar era feminist activist Frieda Wunderlich, whose archive I also should visit. System of exile. I have to keep thinking about that more carefully in the coming weeks and try to figure out what's the criteria, what is good amount, what's too much, and so forth. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. If there are other questions. Otherwise, I think we are all tired, especially Mikko, after this huge amount of questions. And so we thank him once again. Thank you, Mikko, for your presentation. Thank you for all two excellent discussants. And thanks to all who took part in this seminar. I remember this was the third of a serial seminar. I think it was, we'll discuss this with Renato later, but I think it was a good success. The quality of the seminars was excellent, the quality of the debate. So we hope to have another series the next year. Anyway, thank you for now. Thank you for this discussion, and see you soon. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you very much for
Bye.
your
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.
Ciao, Mikko.